The Appalachian Trail stretches 2,190 miles through some of America's most remote wilderness, but what Matias discovered carved into that tree would haunt him forever. His own driver's license photo, with the eyes scratched out, nailed to the bark like a twisted hunting trophy. Callum thought he was losing his mind when dozens of voices began singing hymns around his tent in perfect harmony, until he realized they were coming from beneath the ground where he slept. And Hayes, a battle-hardened military veteran, had faced combat zones around the world, but nothing prepared him for the moment that impossibly tall creature stepped directly onto the trail and began studying him with ancient, intelligent eyes. Tonight, I'm sharing 3 accounts from survivors who encountered something on the trail that defies explanation. These aren't campfire tales. These are real experiences from Matias, Callum, and Hayes that will make you question what lurks in the deep woods. What would you do if you discovered someone had been following your exact route for days, leaving disturbing messages just for you to find? I still check my locks twice every night. Someone was watching me out there. My name is Matias, and I'm a 34-year-old high school teacher from Richmond. After my divorce finalized in September, I needed to get away from everything: the empty house, the pitying looks from colleagues, the constant reminders of my failed marriage. I'd been section hiking the Appalachian Trail for years, doing roughly 100-mile segments during school breaks. It was my therapy, my escape from the noise of everyday life. This time, I planned a 5-day solo hike through Shenandoah National Park in late October, from Front Royal to Swift Run Gap, about 33 miles of some of Virginia's most beautiful trail. The timing was perfect. Peak fall colors painted the mountains in brilliant reds and golds, and the unseasonably warm October days made hiking a pleasure, even though the nights dropped below freezing. Most fair-weather hikers had already packed up for the season, which meant I'd have the trail largely to myself. That solitude, which I'd been craving for months, would soon become my nightmare. I started at Chester Gap on a crisp Thursday morning, my spirits higher than they'd been in months. The first day was everything I'd hoped for: quiet trails, stunning views from Compton Peak, and the therapeutic rhythm of putting one foot in front of the other. I made camp at Tom Floyd Wayside, one of the trail's primitive shelters, and slept better than I had in weeks. For the first time since the divorce papers were signed, I felt like myself again. Day 2 started perfectly. The morning fog lifted to reveal a spectacular view of the Shenandoah Valley, and I made good time toward Skyland Resort. It was around mile marker 42.1 that I first noticed something odd. A fresh blaze on an oak tree caught my attention, not because it was new, but because someone had carved letters into the bark just below it. Matias, my name, spelled out in crude capital letters, the cut still bleeding sap. I stood there for several minutes trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Trail vandalism wasn't uncommon, and Matias wasn't exactly a rare name. It had to be a coincidence. Some other hiker named Matias had passed through recently and decided to mark his territory. I took a photo and continued hiking, but the discovery had planted a seed of unease that would only grow over the coming days. That evening at Rock Spring Hut, I flipped through the shelter's logbook while eating my dehydrated pasta. Most entries were typical: complaints about mice, weather reports, trail conditions. Then I found an entry dated just 2 days earlier that made my blood run cold. Matias from Richmond will be coming through soon. Divorced teacher, drives a blue Honda Civic. He thinks he's alone out here, but he's wrong. Welcome to your new life, buddy. My hands shook as I read those words over and over. Someone knew my name, my profession, my hometown, even my car. They knew I was divorced. They knew I was coming. But how? I told no one about this specific hike except for my emergency contact form filed with the Park Service. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal. The rational part of my mind tried to explain it away. Maybe an ex-student playing a prank. Maybe someone from school who'd overheard me talking about the trip. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. Sleep came in fragments that night. Every sound outside the shelter, every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I kept my headlamp ready and my knife within reach. But morning couldn't come fast enough. Day 3 should have been the highlight of my trip, a beautiful section through Hawksbill Gap with some of the best views in the park. Instead, I hiked in a constant state of hypervigilance, checking over my shoulder every few hundred yards. Around noon, at a scenic overlook called Bear Fence Rock, I discovered something that nearly made me abandon the hike right there. Someone had arranged trail marker stones to spell out Matias in letters 3 feet tall, positioned perfectly so they'd be visible from the main trail. The arrangement was fresh, the disturbed earth still damp, leaves and debris carefully cleared away. This wasn't random vandalism or a coincidence. Someone was following me, staying ahead of me, preparing these messages specifically for me to find. Someone who knew my exact route and timing. I spent 20 minutes scanning the forest around the overlook, looking for any sign of movement, any glimpse of my stalker. Nothing. Just the sound of wind through the trees and my own ragged breathing. That night at Bird's Nest Shelter, I barely slept at all. Every few hours, I'd emerge from my sleeping bag to sweep my flashlight around the campsite, expecting to see a figure watching me from the tree line. Nothing. But in the morning, I found fresh boot prints in the soft earth around my tent. Size 10 or 11 Merrell hiking boots that had circled my campsite multiple times during the night. Day 4 broke gray and foggy, matching my deteriorating mental state. I was jumpy, exhausted, and seriously considering bailing out at the next road crossing. But I was also angry. Whoever was doing this wanted me to run, wanted me to be afraid. Part of me, the stubborn part that had gotten me through the divorce, refused to give them that satisfaction. The final message was waiting for me at a dead oak tree about 2 miles from Skyline Resort. Carved deep into the bark, the letters filled with what looked like red paint or dried blood were the words that still wake me up in cold sweats. I know why you really left him. Below it, nailed to the tree with a railroad spike, was a photocopy of my driver's license. Someone had carefully scratched out my eyes with what looked like a knife point, and, written across the bottom in red ink, "Welcome home." That's when I saw my tent had been disturbed. The zipper was open exactly 6 inches. Not how I'd left it. My sleeping bag had been moved. Someone had been inside my shelter while I was hiking, going through my things, touching everything I owned. The violation was complete and absolute. I packed up in record time and hiked out to Skyline Drive, where I flagged down the first park ranger I could find. The investigation turned up security camera footage showing a tall figure in dark clothing, following my trail at a distance of roughly half a mile. But the person was always careful to stay just out of clear view. They never caught him. 2 years later, I still don't know who stalked me through those Virginia mountains, or how they knew so much about my personal life. I've moved twice since then, changed my phone number, and I never hike alone anymore. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for me to venture into the wilderness again. The worst part isn't the fear. It's the knowledge that someone studied me, learned my habits, my route, my vulnerabilities, and used that information to terrorize me in the place I felt most safe. The trail was supposed to be my sanctuary, my escape from human complications. Now I know that some predators hunt in the wilderness too. What would you do if you woke up in your tent surrounded by the sound of dozens of people singing hymns in perfect harmony? But you're supposed to be completely alone. They were singing beneath me. The dead don't rest easy in these mountains. My name is Callum, and I work as a sound engineer for a recording studio in Nashville. I've spent my entire career understanding audio, frequencies, acoustics, how sound travels and behaves in different environments. What I experienced in the Great Smoky Mountains challenged everything I thought I knew about the physical properties of sound, and it's changed how I hear the world forever. I'd always preferred night hiking to avoid the crowds that flood the Smokies during peak season. There's something magical about moving through the forest in darkness, navigating by sound and instinct rather than sight. My ears are trained to pick up subtle audio cues that most people miss. The difference between wind through pine versus oak leaves, the distinct footfall patterns of different animals, even the way sound reflects off rock faces versus open meadows. These skills had served me well on dozens of solo backpacking trips, but nothing had prepared me for what I encountered during 4 nights in March along the Tennessee-North Carolina border. I started my hike at Newfound Gap, planning to camp in the backcountry between Clingman's Dome and Charlie's Bunyan. The weather was typical for early spring in the Smokies, cold, misty nights with temperatures dropping into the 20s and thick fog that rolled through the valleys like ghostly rivers. Perfect conditions for someone who preferred the solitary experience of night hiking. The first night, I set up camp about 2 miles off the main trail in a small clearing I'd used before. The silence was profound, that deep mountain quiet you only get in true wilderness areas. Around 2 a.m., I was awakened by what sounded like distant singing, faint voices carrying on the night air, too far away to make out words, but close enough to recognize as human vocals. My first thought was other campers, maybe a group of college kids who'd brought a guitar and were having a late-night sing-along around their fire. I listened for maybe 10 minutes before the voices faded, then went back to sleep. In retrospect, I should have paid more attention to the fact that the singing sounded like it was coming from at least a dozen people, all in perfect harmony, with no instrumental accompaniment. That should have been my first clue that something was wrong. Night 2, I camped about 5 miles deeper into the backcountry, in an area where seeing other hikers is genuinely rare. Around midnight, the singing started again. This time, it was closer, much closer. The voices seemed to surround my campsite, coming from every direction at once. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, expecting to see campfires or flashlights indicating other groups nearby. Nothing. Complete darkness in every direction, but the singing continued. The harmony was hauntingly beautiful, old hymns I recognized from my childhood in rural Kentucky. Amazing grace, how great thou art, in the sweet by and by. But there was something off about the voices themselves. They were too clear, too perfect, like a studio recording being played through invisible speakers scattered throughout the forest. As a sound professional, I knew that kind of acoustic clarity was impossible in an outdoor environment with natural sound absorption and reflection. I called out thinking maybe it was an organized group doing some kind of spiritual retreat. Hello? Can you hear me? The singing stopped instantly, as if someone had hit a pause button. The silence that followed was so complete, it made my ears ring. Then, after exactly 30 seconds, the voices resumed, picking up the same hymn at the exact point where they'd stopped. On the third night, I made a decision that would change everything. I set up my portable recording equipment, the same gear I use for field recordings at work. If this was some kind of acoustic anomaly or unusual phenomenon, I wanted to document it properly. I positioned multiple microphones around my campsite and connected them to my digital recorder. The singing began around 1 a.m., and this time I was ready. As the voices filled the air around me, I monitored the input levels and recording quality through my headphones. What I heard through the equipment made no sense. The voices were registering on my microphones, but the frequency analysis showed impossible harmonics. The overtones were perfect mathematical ratios that human vocal cords simply cannot produce. Moreover, the directional microphones were picking up the same audio from every angle simultaneously, suggesting the sound source was somehow omnipresent. I recorded for over an hour, during which the invisible choir performed hymns in languages I didn't recognize. Not just English, but what sounded like Latin, maybe some Germanic dialects, and languages that seemed much older. The voices never wavered, never took breaths, never showed any of the natural imperfections that characterize live human singing. When I played back the recording the next morning, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Embedded in the audio, barely audible beneath the hymns, were what sounded like dozens of individual voices whispering names. Not singing, whispering. Names like Martha, Samuel, Little Catherine, Baby John. The whispers were so faint I had to isolate them using professional audio software to make them clear. On the fourth and final night, something changed. The singing started earlier, around 10 p.m., and it was coming from a different direction. Not around my campsite, but from beneath it. I pressed my ear to the ground and could clearly hear the voices rising from underground, as if there was a massive choir rehearsing in some cavern directly below where I was sleeping. That's when I remembered something a local ranger had mentioned during my permit application. The area where I'd been camping was near several unmarked grave sites from the 1918 flu pandemic. Entire families from isolated mountain communities had been buried in mass graves when the disease swept through the region. The official records were lost in a courthouse fire decades ago, but oral history suggested dozens of people had been interred in the valley where I'd been sleeping for 4 nights. I packed up immediately and hiked out by moonlight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the voices were following me. Even now, 2 years later, I sometimes hear faint hymns when I'm working late in the studio, especially when I'm mixing recordings that involve multiple vocal tracks. My colleagues think it's tinnitus from years of exposure to loud audio equipment, but I know better. I had my recordings analyzed by acoustic specialists at Vanderbilt University. They confirmed that the vocal harmonics were mathematically impossible for human voices to produce, and that the directional audio suggested a point source that was somehow distributed across a wide area simultaneously. They couldn't explain it, but they couldn't debunk it either. The most disturbing part wasn't the impossibility of what I'd recorded. It was realizing that those voices weren't random. They were singing funeral hymns, the same hymns that would have been sung at mass burial services during the 1918 pandemic. They were still holding their memorial service, more than a century later, for people whose names were never recorded, whose graves were never marked. I've never returned to the Smokies, and I probably never will. Some sounds are meant to stay buried, but the mountains remember everything. Sometimes, late at night when the studio is quiet, I can still hear them singing. They're still down there, waiting for someone to remember their names. What would you do if you realized something impossibly tall and thin had been pacing you through the forest for hours, always staying just at the edge of your vision? It was studying me. Something that shouldn't exist was learning how I moved. My name is Hayes, and I'm a 45-year-old former Army Ranger who completed 3 combat deployments in Afghanistan before retiring to civilian life. I mention my military background not to brag, but because it's relevant to what happened to me in Vermont's Green Mountain National Forest. After 20 years of military service, I thought I'd seen everything that could threaten a human being. I was trained to identify hostile movement, to distinguish between natural forest sounds and potential dangers, to trust my instincts when something felt wrong. None of that training prepared me for what stalked me through 4 days of hiking in August 2023. I was attempting my first through hike of the Appalachian Trail, having started in Georgia 5 months earlier. By the time I reached Vermont, I was in the best shape of my life and feeling confident about completing the remaining 500 miles to Mount Katahdin. The Green Mountain section is known for its challenging terrain and remote wilderness areas, but after 1,600 miles of hiking, I welcomed the solitude and the test of endurance. The section from Manchester to Killington Peak covers some of Vermont's most isolated trail, passing through dense hardwood forest and crossing several peaks over 3,000 feet. It was perfect for a hiker who'd grown tired of the crowded shelters and constant chatter of other through hikers. I planned to spend 4 days covering roughly 40 miles, camping in designated backcountry sites where I might not see another human being for days. The first indication that something was wrong came on day 1, about 6 miles north of Manchester. I was making good time on a clear section of trail when my peripheral vision caught movement in the dense forest to my right. In combat, we called it battlefield awareness. That heightened state where your brain processes information faster than your conscious mind can analyze it. Something tall and unnaturally thin was moving parallel to the trail, staying roughly 100 yards away and matching my pace exactly. I stopped and turned to look directly at the spot where I'd seen movement. Nothing. Just thick stands of maple and birch, their leaves creating a green wall that limited visibility to maybe 20 feet. But my instincts, honed by years of military training, were screaming that I was being watched. I continued hiking, but I could feel it out there, keeping pace with me through the forest. Over the next several hours, I caught glimpses of the thing maybe a dozen times, always in my peripheral vision, always just at the edge of detection. It was tall, much taller than any human being, and impossibly thin, like a telephone pole that could move through the forest without making any sound. Every time I turned to look, directly at it, there was nothing there, but the sensation of being observed never went away. That night at Peru Peak Shelter, I met 2 other hikers who'd been on the trail for several days. When I casually mentioned seeing something large moving through the forest, they looked at me like I was suffering from heat exhaustion. One of them, an experienced hiker from Maine, suggested I might be seeing moose or black bears, but I knew the difference between natural wildlife and whatever was following me. This thing moved wrong, like it wasn't bound by the same physical laws that governed normal forest animals. Day 2 brought more sightings, and they were getting closer. The thing seemed to be studying my behavior, learning my hiking patterns and rest stops. When I paused for water, it paused. When I picked up pace on uphill sections, it matched my speed. Most disturbing was that it seemed to anticipate my route, sometimes appearing ahead of me on the trail before disappearing back into the forest when I got too close. Around noon, at a creek crossing near Bromley Mountain, I found the first physical evidence that something unusual was in the area. In the soft mud beside the stream were footprints, unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were roughly human-shaped, but nearly 18 inches long and only about 4 inches wide, as if something with impossibly large, narrow feet had stepped to the water's edge to drink. The depth of the impressions suggested something much heavier than its thin profile would indicate. I took photos and measurements, my military training kicking in automatically. The stride length between prints was over 6 feet, indicating something with legs much longer than any known animal in Vermont. More unsettling was that the prints seemed to lead directly to a massive oak tree, then simply disappeared, as if whatever made them had climbed straight up the trunk. That night, camped in a remote site near Little Rock Pond, I barely slept. Every sound in the forest made me reach for the knife I kept beside my sleeping bag. Around 3 a.m., I heard something large moving through the campsite, circling my tent repeatedly. The footsteps were soft but deliberate, and they stopped whenever I stirred inside my sleeping bag. Through the thin nylon of my tent wall, I could see a shadow passing back and forth, tall enough that its head was well above the roofline. Day 3 was when everything changed. The thing stopped hiding. Around midday, as I was climbing toward Killington Peak, it stepped directly onto the trail about 50 yards ahead of me. For the first time, I got a clear look at what had been following me for 3 days. It was roughly 9 feet tall and impossibly thin, like someone had stretched a human form to breaking point. Its limbs were disproportionately long, its torso unnaturally narrow. The most disturbing aspect was its face, or what should have been a face. Instead of human features, there was a smooth, dark surface that seemed to absorb light, but I could feel it watching me with an intelligence that was both ancient and alien. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, studying each other across that stretch of mountain trail. I had my hand on my knife, but some instinct told me that conventional weapons would be useless against this thing. It wasn't hostile, not exactly, but it was evaluating me the way a scientist might observe a laboratory specimen. Then, without any warning, it stepped sideways off the trail and vanished into the forest, as if it had never been there at all. But I knew it was still out there, still following, still watching. For the remaining day and a half of my Vermont section, I felt its presence constantly. It had decided I was worth studying, and it was gathering information about human behavior and capabilities. I completed my through hike 3 weeks later, reaching the summit of Mount Katahdin on a clear September morning. But even now, 2 years later, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me whenever I enter deep woods. I've researched Vermont folklore and found stories dating back to the 1700s about tall, thin creatures seen in the Green Mountains. The Abenaki people, who originally inhabited the region, had legends about forest spirits that walked between worlds, observing humans but rarely interacting with them. Whatever followed me through Vermont wasn't hostile, but it wasn't natural either. It was something that existed at the edges of our understanding, something that studied us from the shadows of the deep woods. The most terrifying part wasn't the encounter itself. It was the realization that we share this world with things we can't explain or understand. I still hike, but never alone, and never in Vermont. Some trails are walked by more than just humans, and some things are better left undisturbed in the deep forest where they belong. If you've experienced something unexplainable in the wilderness, you're not alone. Share your story in the comments below. Others need to know they're not crazy. And if these accounts from Matias, Callum, and myself have shown you anything, it's that the trail holds more mysteries than we can imagine. Subscribe to Verified Souls for more true encounters from America's most remote places. And remember, some paths are walked by things that were never human at all.